Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founding partner at Nextier, and it's probably the same imagery that conjures for Nigerians as we think about the efforts required to solve our socioeconomic challenges. But you see, my guest today believes that it is indeed possible. It's the theme of his new book. It is possible influencing change in Nigeria. He should know because he spent the last 2 decades of his working life working for organizations across the globe that are focused on driving socioeconomic change across the continent. Until recently, he was George Soros's man in West Africa as the head of Open Society Initiative for West Africa. He was also recently the interim executive director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, a Washington, D.C.-based organization focused on solving the challenges faced by civilians in conflict zones. He recently founded Thoughts and Mace, which is a public policy advisory firm, still focused on these same issues. And he is a fellow of several institutes, Eisenhower Fellow, Stanford Draper Hill Fellow, Yale World Fellow. He's published over 60 publications, op-eds, and about 10 publications, including his recent book. Jude Ilo, welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Now, let's really start at the beginning, and which is, why are we where we are in Nigeria? Why has it been difficult for us to solve the many socioeconomic challenges we face?
Well, that's that's a lot to chew. But I align myself with Chinua Achebe when I say that the problem of Nigeria is the problem of leadership. And the one illustration that can bring this home is the comparison between Nigeria and Singapore. Of course, we know Nigeria is a much, much bigger country, but independence came about the same time, same period. Challenges were similar, in addition to our, of course, multi-ethnic groups. Singapore also had ethnic tensions between the Chinese, the Malay, and all of that. But you had a Lee Kuan Yew who was very clear about what he wanted to achieve for the country. And the first thing he did was to dedicate himself to that cause. And so it wasn't about Lee Kuan Yew being rich. It wasn't about Lee Kuan Yew having the best things life can afford. It was about Singapore being a country that responds to the needs of its citizens. And he had that singular mindset and went into it. There are many reasons why people say he succeeded. There are many reasons he said led to the success of his experiment in Singapore. But 3 things stand out for me. One was investment in people, which made it possible for Singapore to have some of the best hands in every sphere of human development. In a conference in 2007 in Singapore that I attended, where he addressed us, he said that they were sending thousands of Singaporeans to the top schools in the world with the understanding that they will come back and come and support the country. But he knew that a lot of them will not come back. But the idea was that if 2 or 3 come back, they will make a difference. So that's the thinking of a leader. And they invested in their schools locally. They invested in the quality of their civil service. Their civil servants were earning as much as people in the private sector.
Exactly.
And he had one other analogy that was really funny. He said that people have over the years underestimated the power of air conditioner. And we were like, what do you mean? He said he made sure that the working environment for the government bureaucracy was so good. They had air conditioners so that during the hot weather, people may want to leave their houses and come to the office because it's comfortable to be in the office.
Yep.
So that investment in people was key. The second thing was he ran a clean government. meaning that there was no tolerance for corruption. Even for his friends, even for his family members, there was no tolerance for corruption. So there are no double rules for one people and another rule for the other people. Oh, I'm a relative of the president, I'm wife of the president, or that didn't happen. So he made sure that it was a clean government. And that really, really helped, because everybody talk about the fact that there is such a low level of crime in Singapore, but it was a dedicated approach by the leadership. And the third thing was that they invested in social cohesion. He did say to us that because of the tensions between the various ethnic groups in Singapore, they adopted the high-rise approach, where the government builds this high-rise and then gets everybody to go live there. So if you were to be in Nigeria, you will build a high-rise in Abuja. You make sure that there are Igbos, Hausa, Yoruba, Efik, Ibibio. So a mix of people. And he said it's very simple. By the time you live with these people for 1 year, you either know them or you don't know them. And that at every point in time, those deliberate housing policy broke the barriers of ethnic tension and religious tension in Singapore. Of course, this may not work for every country. It may not work for everybody. But in my view, leadership is critical. Leadership is important. And the Singapore story is a way to look at Nigeria and the challenges we face in Nigeria, meaning that since independence, we've not had the right kind of leadership. It's been one story or another. No continuity in government policies, and policies that are anti-people, policies that are not properly thought out. And we see that implication over the years. And in what we are facing now in Nigeria, the total lack of connection between policies and the reality of the Nigerian people. And so that's what we're facing. So there's that leadership gap. The second thing, of course, is the lack of investment in people. We back, in Nigeria, we don't value our people. We've not invested in education in the way that we should. We've not invested in technology in the way that we should. Our human capital development is abysmal. So we've got a problem there. Because if you're not investing in people, which is the main resource for development, natural resources are good, minerals are good, but you need people to manage and harness the potentials of those resources. And we're not investing in people. And sadly, the result is horrible. The quality of graduates we are getting, the quality of the workforce. A lot of executive directors will tell you, a lot of these people are not employable. You hear that story all the time.
Exactly.
In science, we are not innovating because we're not invested in people.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think you've set a good context for the conversation we're about to have. Interestingly, this week's Economist magazine, one of their lead stories on Nigeria and how we subsidize petrol instead of subsidizing people. And the argument is that all the monies we've spent on subsidies, we could have spent building education, building up our healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of plays to what you've talked about. But, just getting back to the book, right? You spent the first part of the book trying to unpack what change means. And I wonder if you can help summarize it for us. So when we talk about change is possible, what does that change mean? What does change mean for you in this context?
Okay. Yeah. If you notice, there was no place in the primer where we tried to define change. And that was deliberate, because sometimes change is subjective. It means for one person one thing, and it means for the next person another thing. But I would say that for me, change is about moving from one state to another, moving from one position to another, moving from one circumstance to another. Now, there's a recent piece I'm writing where I said that change is value neutral, just like time. So there will be change. And former Vice President Oshibanjo made it clear in his forward. He said that there will be change. It is what kind of change it will be that is up in the air.
Yeah.
So when things around us, when policies, when our circumstances move from where it is to another, that is change. In the context of our conversation, of course, we're talking about positive change. And again, sometimes it's subjective because what you consider, the prayer of this government to favor me in Nigeria is a good example. So for some people, as long as the new circumstance is favorable to them, then that change is good enough. For some other people, if it doesn't affect all of us, if it doesn't benefit us as a society, then it's not good enough. For some people, it is about, has something really given, even if it's not the desirable, but is it in the direction of the desirable? If that is the situation, then it's fine. So like I said, it means different things to different people. For me, it's about the fact of not being in one spot. So as long as there's a bit of emotion that is capable of moving you from point A to point B
in a positive direction,
in the positive direction, then for me, change is happening. Fantastic. And that's why I also argue that sometimes it is an unseen motion. You don't even see it, but you realize that what was once a taboo conversation has become a public conversation. It has not changed anything in a sense, but you can now talk about it. Is that something to celebrate? I think, yeah. Because it's from the conversation that you get to the solution, that you get to change of behavior. So that is what change means for me.
And you spend a lot of time talking about, change being incremental. And it kind of resonated with me because when I first got into the, I guess, public policy space, my thinking at the time was that there could be a magic bullet. There could be that button that if you pressed it, everything would work, and I exerted a lot of effort searching for it. And I think I've gotten to a point where it's really, how do we make those marginal shifts? How do we make those dial ticks, in a positive direction? But in the book as well, you talk about, these little fires, and I'm beginning to call it the little fires theory, your little fires theory. How do we convince people that that's enough? For people who are hungry, desperate, who really need significant change to happen, how do you convince them that this little upticks is enough?
I don't even think you can ever convince people that it's enough. Because I think it is the notion of the not enough that keeps us going.
Fantastic.
So to some extent, I think we should never think any of these things are enough. But I think for the change makers, it is important to recognize those little and modest improvements. Because let me just share something. There was a time I was so frustrated with my job in Nigeria. Every year, I'm working on a strategy, I'm working on a work plan, I'm involved in the distribution of all those grants to people to do A, B, C, D. And every year, it seems like nothing is changing. You have election go forward in 2015, it goes back in 2019. You talk about police brutality. SARS is disbanded, SARS comes back enough. So I was really, really frustrated. And I was asking myself, can't I just get a fine, nice job somewhere out in the Bahamas, go practice law, and just have fun? And I was opportune then to go to Stanford for 3 weeks for this Draper Hill Fellowship. And of all the great people that I interacted with, one that stood out for me was Condoleezza Rice. And we had this session, and I said in that session, I said, why should we keep going? And she and others said something quite profound, and the summary of which was that in a situation where you have multiplicity of interest, the results you desire is not easy. It can't be easy. It is impossible to be easy for you to get what you want. And so, as a change maker, your interest is to make sure that you're consistent in the right direction and that you're constantly building collaboration and network of partners who can help you achieve some of the things you wanted. And because policy is a give and take, you cannot come in with a puritanic approach that this is the change I'm looking for and it has to happen. And then they all talked about their own experience, from inability to pass simple regulations in their ministry to the challenge of passing policies in government. For those that went to Iraq to help Iraq fix their systems, they shared their own stories. The Pakistanis shared their own stories. And it became clear to me then in the room that what I was experiencing, the frustration I was experiencing, is being served, as they say in Nigeria, to everybody in the room. and some of them were professors. They've seen big things. So it is a natural thing to be frustrated because change is difficult. And let's keep in mind that for every time we want government or society to do some things differently, some people consider themselves to be losers if those things change. Because there's a status quo that is going to change, that takes away power from them. And in their head, it is us against them. And those forces will always stand up. They will always resist. And because we don't have a total control of the paraphernalia of power, we have to compromise with them to be able to get the best substance of what we want. Perhaps not everything that we want.
Okay, so I understand that. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about timeframes, because I kind of looked for it in the book. I didn't see it. So when you're thinking about change in the context of, say, Nigeria, Africa, what time frame are you looking at? 5 years to 10 years in the short term, 30 years in the medium term, 50 years? And why is that question important? If you're trying to say to people, hang on, we're working on stuff, things can change, whether you're talking to them as government or as civil society, I believe that time frame matters. Or else, if someone feels this is not going to change in my lifetime, many people might not be inspired to put in the effort required.
Yeah, I mean, the time frame question is one I've also grappled with. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it happens in months. So it is difficult because we're looking at change as a holistic. Of all the things happening to us, we want better education. We want safety in our roads. We want our kids to go out in the morning. We don't have to worry about them being kidnapped and all of that. We want to go home for Christmas and be relaxed. We want to go into the hospital and get. So there's a whole lot of stuff we need, and so it is difficult to put a time frame to it. And I also don't think it is our job, really, especially those of us who work in the civil society sector, to tell people, "Oh, take it easy; it's going to be better." It's not our job. Our job is to tell them to be impatient, really, to tell them to put fire in the feet of their representatives, to tell them to be good citizens. It is now. So Dr. King talked about the evil of gradualism, where we say the time is not right. Maybe we should take it easy, then gradually people will understand. And he said that the time is always right to do the right thing. And so it's a bit of a complicated conversation in terms of time frame. It is now or later. But my middle ground is simple. The effort should start happening now, even if the change doesn't happen immediately. The effort on our parts, as those of us who are in the civil society space, or policy people, or change makers, government, the effort should start happening now. So it is not okay to tell us, I cannot feed you because we don't have money. In my government, we don't have money, so we can't feed you. You should tell us, this is what I'm trying to do to feed you. So this whole notion, especially in Nigeria, that is okay to suffer, that the government calls us to sacrifice. When we don't see similar sacrifices, either in their opulence or in their debased dysfunctionality, we don't see any patience in them buying their jet. We don't see any patience in them buying their cars. But they say, you know what, guys, this is going to be tough before it gets better. But we are not sharing the toughness part of it. So that doesn't work. So that level of gradualism, I'm totally against. So if we are going to make sacrifices as a country, as a continent, the government should lead the charge in the sacrifice. I should be the one saying, oh, my president is sacrificing so much. Then it makes sense for me to sacrifice. But in a situation where this whole conversation about let us wait, this might not be the time. Oh, young people, is not yet your time. And then the young shall grow is there, and the young shall grow becomes 70, and it's not yet their time.
Exactly.
It just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
And I like some of the examples you used in the book from the civil rights era. You know, Dr. King, the example of Emmett Till, you know, happening to set the grounds for a Rosa Parks to happen and for Rosa Parks to then lead to the civil rights bill. But if we step back a little bit and say, but for us in the context of Nigeria and Africa, how would this change happen? You know, what are the steps? Even first of all, how do we define what change means in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, very classist society, multiple cleavages? How do we even agree on what this change should be? And then how does it happen?
Very, very, very important question you're asking there. So what are our common denominators?
Yes.
What are the things we agree on?
Yes.
Which has been a struggle for a country like Nigeria. But there are some things we've seen, to be honest, which tells me that, you know, this thing is possible. So look at the case of the issue of gender-based violence. Last 20 years, it was a non-starter. It was a conversation that is hushed outside of the civil society space. But look at where we are now. We've got the Violence Against Persons Act. We've got the Child Rights Act. We've got all these agencies being set up by governments in the states, federal level. We've got NAPTIC. We've got all these things that are making it incredibly difficult for people to get away with violating women. We are hearing conversations now about inheritance in places in Nigeria where decades ago, nobody talked about it. We are seeing women in places in the country where before they couldn't, now making decisions. We are seeing the girl child excel in academics. And we are hearing stories that there are more girls in secondary school than there are boys. So for me, that is something. And it didn't just happen in the vacuum. A lot of people, a lot of women, a lot of men, a lot of change makers, they've been working in this space for decades, quietly. And of course, I can imagine their frustration over the years. But here we are, where the federal government declares a national emergency on gender-based violence. I mean, they may not live up to it, but for me, the significance of such a pronouncement tells me that things can happen in this country, regardless of what we see. So take the issue of public finances. We are at a point now where a budget can analyze the budgets and tell you who is getting what money. So we're hearing the stories about an institute that is going to build road in another state that has nothing to do with its mandates. You know, I don't want to go into the details of all of that. but Patrick,
just to say that the reports are on budget.org, I believe.
Yes.
So you can download and read them.
It's unbelievable. What is like fiction, it's like a movie. But these things were not possible 20 years ago. So to some extent, my argument is simple. We are not there yet. But things are changing. And to your question about, you know, what's the common denominator? These are the common denominators. We want our women to be free, to walk the streets and not fear about being molested. We want people who are in marriages not to be a punching tool or punching bags for their husbands. We want government to be open, to tell us what they're doing with their money. And when they don't tell us, we tell them we know. And we hold them accountable for it. So to a reasonable extent, we can acknowledge there are some movements, but it's not nearly enough. It is not enough. So that's why I'm saying that we cannot also become slaves to gradualism. We can't do that. And we have to have the not enough spirit, which means that we'll keep demanding for more. So now we know that these guys are building roads instead of doing their business with plane and aerodynamics. But what next? Who gets punished for this? Which National Assembly member inserted this bogus money? And what are the consequences? So we need to go from the point of exposure to consequences.
Exactly.
And I think we are gradually getting there, but it has not happened yet.
Okay. And in the book, you give 3 big examples of how change happened, you know, or at least actions towards change. You used a lot of the examples from SARS. The second one was Abuja, you know, coalition against abuse of women, you know, who at the time, if women were seen walking or, you know, returning from anywhere at night, they were turned prostitutes and, you know, locked up without trial, etc. Those were really collective action problems that we were able to get around, you know, so change really is a collective action problem. From your experience, from your work across the continent, can you share with us how people come together to really solve this collective action problem and then derive some level of movement in the positive direction?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is born out of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, a lot of these things come out of, you know, out of frustration. And when people are frustrated, then they are pushed to innovate about what needs to happen. No, but on a serious note, there's something Fukuyama said. I'm trying to see where I know I wrote it was used somewhere here. So, but the summary of it is that it takes the bold action or brave action of just one person responding to injustice to trigger change and to have people rally around him or her. So 4 things I want to say to your question. One is that there has to be a problem of which people agree that is a problem. Sometimes it takes convincing. It takes me talking to you, Patrick, to say this is a problem. We need to do something about it. And so there's this collective awareness that we've got a problem and we need to deal with it. And SARS was a good example. Police brutality targeted against young people, especially tech boys. You know, Abuja raid was a good example. In Senegal, it was about the tenure of the president, Abdoulaye Wade, President Wade. So there's no problem. People agree that this is a problem we need to solve. The second thing is that people understand their role in solving it. So I know that I'm a journalist, I need to report it. I'm a musician, I put it in my music and get people to hear about it. I'm a policymaker, I write policy. I'm a community organizer, I mobilize people. So everybody sees a role for themselves in solving that problem. You know, NSAS again is a good example. The musicians who were singing, the organizers who were organizing, the doctors who were treating those who were, you know, so people see themselves in it and see a role. The third thing is that there's clarity about where we want to go to. There has to be clarity because the moment there's no clarity, then there's confusion. So there's a clarity about where you want to go to. So if you look at the example, the Burkina Faso case about Blaise Compaoré, they wanted the guy out. And everything that is associated with him, they were very clear about that. And when ECOWAS came and offered a mediation process that suggested keeping some remnants of Blaise Compaoré's men, they lost credibility with the Burkinabés. So that clarity about where we are going to. In NSAS case, it became a problem because there were too many directions and too many destinations. And the inability to then conceive a cohesive outcome and the lowest common benchmark made it impossible for the group to then, you know, sustain the movement. And then, of course, whatever government did then happened. So
yeah, I think that's kind of a good place to segue to a deeper discussion of NSAS. But let me just read out the Francis Fukuyama quotes, you know, that you were looking for, and it's from part C of the book, and it says, and it is frequently the case that without small acts of bravery in response to small acts of injustice, the larger train of events leading to fundamental change in political and economic structure would never occur. You know, from Francis Fukuyama, from part C of the book. And you spent a lot of time talking about SARS in the book, and maybe some of the lessons of old that they did not integrate in the design of that struggle. Can you spend a bit of time on that, especially with a focus on who should lead change? You know, on the one hand, there's an argument for having an arrowhead to lead change, but there's also an argument for having a decentralized leadership, you know, of such projects. Where do you fall on that debate?
I think there are no wrong answers, frankly. There are no wrong answers. I think each context and each generation would define for themselves the best approach. But when you look at the SARS situation, first, I will always start by acknowledging the bravery and the courage of the young men and women who came out into the streets, because they asked a very tough question and government had no answer. You know, these guys in their action retold the story of Nigeria in their own language. We are told Muslims, Christians, there's a tension between them. They never get along. There's always issue. When elections come, they debunk that myth. We were told we're always separated by our ethnic interests. If my brother is in government, then I have to protect him or her. They debunk that myth. We were told the young people, they have an interest in government. They debunked that too. We were told they're irresponsible. They raise the money. They refuse to accept money from anybody.
Yep.
Right? So in that simple 7 days, these guys were able to say to Nigeria and to say to the world, we've come of age. We've got a voice, and we are not going to roll over. So that's an important lesson to take. And there's a lot of things to learn from that movement and what they were able to achieve. Now, of course, there is no perfect movement. So there were places things could have been done differently. I think it was a huge mistake not to learn from the past. And I talked a lot about in the book about the bridge, the generational bridge. You know, you stand on the shoulders of your forebearers to see the future. And they might not get there. But they're not getting there. It's not because they are silly people or they are weak people. It's just that it wasn't their time to get there. And so that inability to learn lessons from the movement in Nigeria, especially the movement against the military, for which the guys who did it as young people, had incredible courage, and they were successful. So those lessons were not learned. There was this notion of...
Who's to blame? Sorry to cut in, but who's to blame for that lesson not being passed on? Is it the young people who did enter, the older generation, or our generation?
The older generation will take 80% of that blame, because we did not pass on that knowledge. And it is something, a theme I have gone back to several in my work over the years, to say we need to start teaching people what happened before they were born. I'm not just talking about history of Nigeria, but the movement. You know, the Olisabakobas of this world, the Clement Nwankwo's of this world. Clement was about 25.
Yep.
When they founded
Innocent Chukwuma.
Innocent Chukwuma. So we need to tell those stories so people can see that, yes, I'm doing something great, but it's been tried before, and there's something for me to learn. So they missed that connection. The second thing they missed also was the fact that government runs like a machine. So government is a humongous bureaucracy. It's not a place where one man can stand up and say, you know what, done. We're doing this. They will frustrate your life. So you needed to find a way to work with the progressive forces in government. Give them a cover outside of government so they can do your job inside of government. That didn't happen. So I'll give you one example. At the time of this protest, the IG, the Inspector General of Police, was actually one of those people who were saying that, look, let's listen to these kids. and see what we can give to them and see how we can address this problem. What happened? They called for the sack of the IG because they felt the police were doing something wrong. And I understand that passion, but not being able to understand the dynamics of what's happening behind the scene made them pick on the wrong guy. And the guy, of course, turned immediately because you can't be sticking your neck out for those who are calling for your sack. Similarly, the presidency asked the Human Rights Commission to consider a panel of inquiry immediately to ascertain, a couple of things. And they said, no, the National Human Rights Commission doesn't have the jurisdiction and statutory power to do what you're asking them to do. It is not for you to say, this is your ally. You see what I mean? So those mistakes were made and they were lost opportunities. Of course, the third one was the objective. So you have your goal and you have where you can land comfortably if you don't meet your goal. The goal was not clear. The lowest possible benchmark was not clear. And so there was all this conflicting messaging, which of course then gave the impression that this was an anarchy kind of thing. And the final point, which I feel was a missed opportunity, was the narrative building. The young people were very focused on social media. But that is a small percentage of Nigerians who are there. So their narrative didn't even get into the mainstream media. In fact, they refused to talk to the mainstream media because they said those ones were biased. But this was where their parents were watching. This was where most of the middle class were watching. And these are the guys you needed to influence so they can tell their friends in government to listen to the kids in the streets. And government took over that media, took over that platform, and projected a story of fear and anarchy.
Correct.
And a lot of parents wanted the protest to stop. And they could exert influence on their children not to go out on the street. So that again was a missed opportunity. So the power mapping wasn't very good. And these are things, if you had the intergenerational relationship where we are telling the younger ones what happened, the much we knew about the past, and them learning from it, it would be easy to have a convergence. I quoted Commons in his song that is the wisdom of the old and the strength of the young.
Exactly.
That's used to create change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So did the End Bad Governance organizers learn anything from the End SARS organizers? And how do you juxtapose that to the protests that we saw in Nairobi?
So for the End Bad Governance organizers, I think there were some lessons learned because I was privy to few conversations where they were very particular about presenting a manageable list of demands, which I felt was very good, was a very good initiative, having that manageable list. The second thing they did, which I think was good, was to give themselves a timeline. We'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, we'll stop, we appraise, we'll come back. That was also good. So you could see the end point of what they want to do. The third thing, again, I think they were very, very good with the media. They were speaking out. They were not just confined to social media. They were all over the places. And they gave notice of what they wanted to do. Now, NSAS didn't give notice, it was spontaneous. But when folks gave notice, government started to undermine almost immediately the ability to convene. So again, no hard and fast rule, but but I think they learned something. In Nairobi, again, Nairobi said we had no leaders, but they had leaders. So the truth of the matter is that you could say we don't want to present a representative, but there are leaders. We know there are leaders. These things can happen in the vacuum.
Exactly.
But it takes humility for the leaders to say, we want to be in the backstage and project our people forward. So instead of calling me for a meeting in the government house, come to us and address us as a collective. I think that was really, really impressive. I think that was good because that way you try to protect the leadership from being isolated by government and then dealt with. So that was something I think was really nice from what I saw from the Kenyan part.
Okay, so we see these protests happen. We see that when they're announced or when they're in progress, government rallies, tries to do something, tries to negotiate, tries to work some deal out. Why wait? You know, I mean, and here is, you're not sitting in front of, I don't know, the IG, the president. What's the argument to put in front of them to say, why wait until the kids are out on the streets to offer these changes? Why don't you do them now? How do you, knowing that, and I know you understand how government works, you know, you understand the inner workings of government and you understand the challenges that leaders face. But what's that? How do you present that argument to a government to say, start engaging with these people before they get out on the streets? Because what you can buy now is much cheaper than what you pay once they're out on the streets.
So, see, I've asked myself this question a zillion times, Patrick. I mean, we've had friends who went into government, so they know these things. And then we ask ourselves, why are they not doing it? And the few times I've gotten close to the workings of government, the machinery of government is structured in a way that is designed to fail. So that even when the best idea is coming, the bureaucracy kills it. And there's an analogy Olisa Abakoba used to give when I was working with him about the political government and the technical government. The technical government is the bureaucracy, is the civil service. The political government is the politician. And he said to me, look, if the technical government is functioning, everything works. Even when the political government is not working well. Because the political government in and out of itself cannot do anything without the technical government. But the technical government can function without the political government. And he said that over the years, we have put a lot of emphasis on the political government. What kind of leaders are we electing? What is the leadership process and all of that? And you bring in the best leaders and they confront a dysfunctional technical government. They will kill the leader's dream on day one. And Okonjo-Iweala's book speaks volume about that. And so,
reforming the unreformable.
Exactly. My answer to your question is that we need to focus on this technical government and we'll fix it. Because it doesn't matter how good our ideas are. When it gets into that destruction machine, by the time it comes out, it becomes unrecognizable. That is why you want to get money out to fix a problem, and it takes you 1 year to get the money out. Exactly. And by the time the money comes out, the solution you've designed is out of place and outdated.
And so the problem has metastasized.
Exactly. Let's fix the technical government. Perhaps that will let the political government do the right thing. Exactly.
And in the book, you talked about change agents and, you know, how for change to happen, you need to build a network, you know, of change agents, and you spoke a bit about how that process works. Can you help us unpack how, you know, any society that's really focused on driving change, you know, should be looking to build that network of change agents?
I'll share my own experience. I didn't put it in the book because I just felt like I didn't have to put it in the book. So we had an informal network in the National Assembly after 2019. They were called the Progressives. You will not see a document where they exist. So for the interest of their confidentiality, I will not mention their names. But there were about 10 of them or 12 of them. Some in the Senate, some in the House of Reps. The idea why we initiated setting up that platform.
And by we, you mean Osiwa, right?
Osiwa and one or two other partners, whose name I shall not mention, was simple because we felt that National Assembly was dysfunctional. And they were passing all this terrible, you know, investing in all this terrible anti-civic space legislation, that were not making sense. And so the progressives had a very simple task. One was to look at the lay of the land and see the kind of laws that are needed and the kind of laws that needed to be prevented. And we meet the projects didn't cost us more than $50,000. And it was mainly for research, for meetings, for retreats, just to bring them together and talk through. So we meet in the evenings and look at where we are, what activities should we be carrying out. These guys religiously were showing up. They were recruiting their own members. So they were not, it wasn't open to anybody. So they'll go to you, they see the way you operate, and they bring you in. Let me just say that those guys were responsible for killing two of the most obnoxious legislations of that assembly.
One being the civil rights, the civil society bill.
Exactly. Yes. They were instrumental in killing it. And there were so many more. There were so many more. And it was a model of intervention that we were experimenting with, and I felt made a lot of sense. Building a nexus of progressive elements in government, letting them know that they are not alone. So we try to expand it in such a way that not just within the National Assembly, but finding other people in government who are doing good work and bringing them together. So they have a network of solidarity amongst themselves, and they complement each other's work and provide each other with information and all of that. We didn't go all the way, but with the National Assembly, this was how successful that approach was.
Why didn't you deepen that initiative? Why didn't you go all the way, using your words? If you saw that it was effective, what stopped it?
So one was time, because within that period there was another election. Things changed here and there. People left, people didn't come back, so you need to start building up again a new consortium of people. But I think it is something I would encourage others, especially funders and folks in the CSO sector, to do. The other thing we wanted to do before I left Osiwa was to do a national mapping of change agents. And here we're not talking about the big boys. In communities, the guy who can rally the neighborhood youths to clean up the environment. And we wanted to have information about them and recognize them and link them up with others, so they know that people are seeing what you're doing and people are learning from you. So when I was in the Eisenhower Fellowship, I went to Baltimore, and Baltimore has a very terrible story in terms of even development, crime, and everything.
Violence.
And there were people like that in the communities who were kept in salary. So OSF, US, had people that identified in Baltimore, and they kept them in salary and said to them, we're not asking you to do anything, but we'll pay you a living wage so that you can keep doing what you're doing. And when that riot happened in Baltimore, those guys were central in healing and protecting that community. And so when I saw that model, I came back to Nigeria and I said to myself, can we do this? And of course, I couldn't get it done. One of my few regrets before I left Osiwa. But that's the kind of thing I'm thinking. Finding all these people who are doing hard work, the women who have influence in the marketplace, who are helping other women, building a network around them and supporting them to just do what they are doing. We're not telling them to write proposal. Just keep doing what you're doing and how you're doing it.
So if you put back your hat as Osiwa, head of Osiwa in West Africa, and how you usually back then demanded that your grantees show how they're measuring impact. What you've just described would be difficult to quantify. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, yes. Because, okay, so you're lucky that in the period you did it, you were able to kill 2 bills. Okay, you can show that, but it's also possible that you were still in an incubation phase for X number of years.
Exactly.
Okay. So how do you measure impact? How do we know that change is happening? How do we know that we're making progress? How do we justify this to ourselves if you're funding it yourself, or to funders if you're getting grants from organizations to do this type of work?
So let me also say the writer to this book is a primer we've started, working on funding change. And the first argument is that this whole time factor, this whole outputs-focused approach to fund making didn't really work well, in my experience. So show me what you've done. Because sometimes impacts are intangible. So take, for instance, we have this network of 200 Nigerians scattered across the country. The woman just walks in the streets and does her thing. She's the first to come to the market. She's last to go. She makes it clean. She makes sure it's cleaned up every day. How do you say you understand? It's difficult. But what I can do is to tell you the story of what she's doing. So I also think that our storytelling capacity has to improve, because sometimes when we're focused on numbers, what the stories we tell about the impact of our work becomes too academic. But this woman being able to continue to do this for years, for months, in my view, is success, because you've given her the support that she needed. So there's always a challenge about measuring. And a lot of times funders spend big money and send researchers into the field to use sophisticated systems to measure impact. I think there's gain to that if it happens maybe every 5 or 10 years. But I think that when we want to do this kind of community-based, out-of-the-box funding, our focus is about the subject of our funding being able to keep doing what they're doing. Because by the time we came to them, we already saw the impact. Word of mouth. People are telling us, and I mean, I can say it here. So I went to FISAYO, Foundation of Investigative Journalism. I had never met him. I had never seen him. I had no clue who he was, but I was reading what he was doing and the risk he was taking, especially when he did that report on the prison.
Exactly.
And we went to him and we said to him, we like what you're doing. We want to give you some funding so you can keep doing what you're doing. And he was thinking, where is this coming from? And I know, being the kind of decent guy he was, he did a due diligence on us. I kid you not. He said, where are these guys coming from? But here we are, we've got Foundation of Investigative Journalism, and they are doing fantastic work. This was the same thing we did with Brekete radio program.
In Abuja.
At a time when it was just a 2-hour program, we went to him, had a conversation, and helped him to start documenting what he was doing, and hired, few people around him for him to do his work. And today he has the Human Rights Radio. And so some of our most impactful projects were projects that were driven from proof of concepts, which we didn't demand for, which wasn't given to us. The one we saw, and we went there and we invested money, and it continued.
Okay, so and that's a good segue to how do you institutionalize these interventions, to ensure that, okay, after you walk away from it, that it continues. The Human Rights Radio is a very good example. He's so impactful. I think probably all the drivers in Abuja, taxi drivers, even your own personal drivers, will force you to listen to the ordinary president. Yeah. But how do you really institutionalize these interventions so that when the funder steps away, they can continue to be impactful?
Yeah. Patrick, is really difficult. It's really, really difficult. It's not. So you can say, oh, we give you money for institutional building, we provide networks. It's really difficult. But some of the things we did, I can share. One was the process of developing the project and the funding. We always use it as a period of building their capacity to design program in a way that other funders might be interested in the work they are doing. So we use that process of project development and program development to create some skill, to support their skill to be able to do it without us.
Mm.
We try to help them recruit people who can then take out some of the work from them and allow them to be more strategic in their planning, in their thinking. We funded business plans for some of them to help them. But I think the biggest gift we offer is the gift of exposure. So we talk about them everywhere we go. We take them to places. We give them the opportunity to travel when we have, so they can go and talk to people about their work. And some of the partnerships they've been able to gain from those kind of solidarity visits and engagement help them to sustain the operation. We also talk to others to say, these guys are doing a great job, please support them. But again, the other thing I made sure I did was the ecosystem. So within the space of, say, media, for instance, getting all the guys who are doing this important work to work with each other, to know each other, to support each other. I mean, sometimes it fails, sometimes it works, but it helps that people can see the connection between their work and the next person's work. And just like I argue in the book, that level of complementarity then scales up the impact of what is being done. But it's really, really difficult, Patrick, because I know that some of the guys we worked with, some of the people we helped establish the organization, some of them now are struggling. Because it is not also okay to think that in 4, 5, 6 years, new organizations can stand on their own. So that hand-holding needs to continue for a bit of a time. So my argument in the Funding Change primer is that we say change is a marathon. Funding is a marathon. You have to stay with these guys for a bit, not just 3 years, 4 years. You have to stay with them for a bit so that when you walk away, they've learned to work properly and they can do it on their own.
Fantastic. And I can see that the chat room is alive with a lot of comments, but to say that very soon we're going to open it up for questions from the participants. Please type your questions in the Q&A tab. That's where I'm going to be looking. I can't scroll through all the comments in the chat room, but in the Q&A, I will post the questions and I will attribute the questions to you. But before we go to the Q&A, Jude, how do we think about this? So there's a place for personal responsibility from the followers to drive change, but there's also an argument that there's a structural challenge with the country, and that part of the problems we have in Nigeria could be more structural and difficult for an individual to really change. Where do you land on this debate, and how do we deal with this agency versus structure argument?
Yeah, so I think they're not, it's not a contradiction. I think they're all part of the same pool. We can do things differently in our various corners and, improve the life around us, confront our challenges with a lot more positivity, be kind to people. Be kind to people. I mean, if there's something I've seen in social media in Nigeria, is the level of hate and the level of people are mean. People are mean. It's unbelievable the level of meanness you see in those spaces. So I think there's a place for individual responsibility. They say it starts this thing about the man in the mirror. So if you start with yourself, and in our place they say, so you have to start doing right in your house first before you can then go outside to do the right thing. So I think there's a place for individual responsibility. I also agree there's a structural problem because the interactions in our country is often driven by graft, it's very transactional and it's very exploitative. So people are about what can I take out of the system and not what can I give into the system. And understandably so, because I said I have a love-hate relationship with Nigeria because loving Nigeria is like screaming into an echo chamber. All you hear is the sound of your voice. Nobody answers you back. So I can understand why people want to extract from a system that has actually offered them nothing, in a sense. However, it is not an excuse for us to then say that because the system is bad, let's leave it as it is. The truth of the matter is that government has the duty for security, for well-being, for prosperity, and all of that. And if that structure is not working, if the system that holds that thing is not working, everything we're doing is just palliative.
Yeah.
And in the Nigerian parlance, palliative doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I think three things I think is important. One is that we don't know each other. Across ethnic and religious lines, there's a lot of ignorance, which has been exploited over the years. There are some people who still believe that from Benue State all the way to the far north,
it's not a
people by Hausa people.
Hausa Fulani.
Yes.
Whatever
So
that means.
that level of ignorance is similarly the other way around. You know, these people are not good people. I don't want these people to live in my house, kind of thing. But those of us who have been
let me pose a question. Is it
Yeah.
possible to create a new tribe in Nigeria? Is it possible to create a tribe that is not dependent on ethnicity or religion, but dependent on shared experiences? And if yes, how do we navigate that?
I think so. I think it is possible. And we have to give Obasanjo credit for trying to build a tribeless Nigeria. We have to give him credit for that. It's, you know, whatever one might have against him, he ran a government where he brought in people who were qualified, who could do the job, without any due attention about which part of the country that they come from.
Okay, so that's what else? What else can we do? What else can civil society actively do to create a new tribe? A new tribe who, and I'm not saying, I think I'm Igbo, I'll always be Igbo, you know, I will enjoy Igbo music, but is it possible to be Igbo and be Nigerian? Because I share the same experiences with someone who I've never met from Sokoto, from Opobo, and that that our Nigerianness is so strong that it will hold up against any other affiliations, not diminishing those affiliations, but hold up strongly in our fight for a new Nigeria. If yes, what are some thoughts on how we navigate building that new tribe?
I mean, Patrick, I agree with you 100%. And SARS was a good example of that tribeless Nigeria. Because in that demonstration, there were no Igbo, there were no Hausa, there was no anything. There were young people who felt that government had to do some things differently. I think it was amazing to watch where all of those sensitivities were thrown aside and people just were young, angry, and demanding action. So, and they didn't need any of us to do it. They did it themselves. And I think it is possible. I can also share a personal experience with you. When I came to the Netherlands and I had resumed work in my office, I was living in a hotel. My family, they were coming in and we couldn't get accommodation because there was always a housing crisis here. And my two young daughters were going to live in the hotel for God knows how long before they could move into an apartment. And somebody I met here, I met her through an Italian who said to me, somebody from your country, her son is a friend to my son. And they gave me her number. And then I called her. Long story short, she gave me her house for 10 days. She went on vacation, handed me the key to her house and said, when your family comes, they shouldn't stay in a hotel. Stay in my house for 10 days. She was Yoruba. She was Muslim. I've never met her. That is being one tribe. At that moment, we were just two Nigerians looking out for each other.
Foreign land, looking out for each other.
Looking out for each other. And she saved me a lot of money. You can bet.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't ask. That's the interesting thing, Patrick. I didn't ask.
Mm.
And I was reluctant to take it. And she insisted and said to me, this is not up for debate.
Mm-hmm.
You are taking these kids to my house. You're not staying in a hotel.
Fantastic story.
And that happens every day in Nigeria. But somehow we are all focused. We're all focused on the story of what went wrong. During the Biafra War 50-year commemoration that the then acting president Osinbajo came, he talked about the story of his friend who went home during the war and how everything belonging to that family was kept intact. In the 13 months of the war, they came back and they got them all back, or something of that nature, right? So I think we need to tell more stories.
By the way, it's the same story. It's the same story between Otumba Shibomi Balogun of FCMB and Alex Ekweme. Yeah.
Fantastic.
How they saved. But anyways, yeah. So good point. Let me read some of the thoughts or questions from our participants. There's one from Onyeka on the NSAS. Do you think that the lack of identified leadership impacted its outcome? I believe you've addressed that. Valentine Achum, is it possible to drive some sustainable progress and positive change without constantly relying on government intervention? How can private stakeholders, industry leaders, and communities collaborate to create a self-sustaining ecosystem that thrives independently of government support?
Interesting question. I think there are things we can do without government, but there are limitations to what you can do without government, to be honest. However, I will agree with him that we should try to do the things we can without government. Patrick, we've talked about the African American Museum of History in DC. It wasn't built by government. It was built by private people. It was built by, everyday Americans and some of the rich people in America. So initiatives like that tell us that outside of government, people can do things. In my estates, Queen's Estate in Abuja, we built our road. We did. I can't remember the number of kilometers, but all the estates in that neighborhood came together, contributed money, and built the road. And so we need to also acknowledge that Nigerians are doing things for themselves. There are some companies who are also helpful to community. Do I think the private sector in Nigeria can do more? Hell yes.
Of course.
They can do a whole lot more. But we have a government or a system of government in Nigeria where private entities do not in reality have any rights, because governments can deal with them any way they want the moment they feel that they are a threat, either to them politically or to their influence or to their whatever. So
Fantastic.
the lack of protection, legal protection, and this is about state capture, which is not part of what we're discussing here. I don't want to go into it. But the problem of state capture means that private entities cannot actually take independent actions without the sign-off of government.
Sure.
So to the last question, that's where the challenge is.
Sure.
But it's already happening in some ways.
Yeah. Let me take another question from Olumide Adetiba. He likes your analogy of the political and technical governments. He says it's apt, but what suggestions can you offer to improve the functioning of the technical government?
So there is a report right now, the white paper, the Orosana report. It is not perfect, but it is something that is a product of years and years and years and years of inquiry, of research, of consultation. It is there. Why are we not using it? So it's not for me to come and say, let's do this. We've got a product that is the outcome of some of the best brains in this country. We're not using it. So my answer to you, my brother, is let's go back to that report. Let's start from there and see how we can reform this technical government so that able-bodied men and women should not come to the office in the morning and do nothing. It is not fair to them. It is not fair to the country. And a good example is a refinery. It doesn't produce jack. People get paid salaries. It then is maintained year in, year round. Anyway, let me not go there. So yeah.
Excellent. And I have another question here from Jenchang Fabong. He says, the leaders in question come from amongst us. from the societies and communities we all know. They were also part of the followers in the past. What will we say about the quality of followership, right? I have a hard time reconciling the quality of leadership emanating from a bad followership. Can you throw more light on this complex relationship, followership and leadership?
So, come, guys, don't be asking me these questions that will give me headache. So the truth is, can we do better as followers? Yes, to be honest, yes, we can. Now, but this is where it becomes a problem for me. Why should I tell my neighbor to pay tax when I know the money he pays or she pays for the in tax is being filtered away? Why should I tell somebody to sacrifice for Nigeria where those who have sacrificed in the past are treated like they're stupid? If you go into government, you don't steal money. Oh, this one is a useless person. So it's a catch-22, frankly. But I do then think that we have seen flashes of effective followership. SARS is one example. Communities coming together to do things for themselves. Examples, some of the examples. Our sports, our young men and women who are in sports, who go way and beyond, sometimes in spite of the state, to be successful. The power of our music, how our music has become a major tool for selling our country. We've seen all of these things. I think, to the person asking the question, to myself, to all of us on this call, what can we learn from these good examples, and how can we begin to replicate them? If somebody can train without proper support and win medals, how can I, without proper support in my own government, excel in my own field, and then use the power of my influence to help others hold that same government accountable for what they are not doing? So I guess that's part of the things we have to be thinking about. But I don't have all the answers.
Fantastic. We have a question from Professor Richard Joseph, author of that classic Democracy and Prebendalism in Nigeria. And thanks, Prof, for joining, as always. His question is, why do we have such high resources, economic, intellectual, cultural, and such poor outcomes? Why the pronounced performance gap?
Yeah, I mean, in one sentence, the translation of those potentials into actionable policy has become a problem. And that translation is lost in our technical government, is lost in our political government, is lost in the structures we've talked about here, the socioeconomic structures of the country that doesn't dispose itself to excellence, but more about extraction. So I think that's where it is lost, frankly. But do we have great people? Yes, we do. Great ideas? Yes, we do. The translation process is always a problem. It doesn't translate because of those structural and governance inadequacies that kill those ideas in inception.
And I think you also spoke about it in your opening comments, where you located it within Achebe's The Trouble of Nigeria being the failure of leadership. Yeah, I mean, we've seen countries that are as well resourced, but had that translation challenge, but once they focused on it, they were able to deliver what you may even call an economic miracle. And
exactly.
Here I'm thinking of China. But we have another question from Ambassador Onoja. And he says, thank you for your great work in nation building and national development. My question is about the current sliding in civil society movements in Nigeria. Passivism has crept into the civil society, or what I can call a break in civil society movement, or a sleeping moment. And he puts it in quotes. Do you agree with this? If you do, please, what do you think is responsible for this sleeping moment or a break in civil society movement? And what can be done to reignite civil society organizations in Nigeria, which we most need now? Ambassador Onoja.
Ambassador, you're putting me on the spot. You see how I'm carrying my face when they're reading that question. Yeah, Patrick, I think people are tired. And it's part of the reason I decided to do this book. People are tired, and understandably so. If you are somebody who's been working on election since 2023, it's a toxic relationship. It goes up and down, it goes up and down. So people are tired. And now we're also looking at a government that is very deliberate and brutish about shrinking the civic space, muscling alternative voices, and not broking any form of opposition. So I think people are tired. I think this is a time where we need to look for something deeper in us to energize us to keep going. And if I'm being very honest, part of the reasons I accepted a job outside of Nigeria was because I was also tired. You know, you can't keep doing this thing day in, day out, day in, day out. I had the opportunity of sitting with an incoming government, helping them develop a blueprint of what was supposed to be this. They didn't implement one thing from that document. Not even one. And we didn't just do it, we provided resources for it. So so people are tired. But again, we can't be tired. We can't be tired. We have to find something in us. So I asked myself, the first 1 year when I took a job out of Nigeria, I said I was going to disconnect. People will call me to share ideas. I'm like, no. I don't want to do this anymore. But at some point I told myself, this is home. I love this country to death. I love my friends. I love my families. I love my village. If I don't go back to my village during the Christmas, I probably will be depressed the next year. So there's no way we can allow ourselves to be beat down by what is obviously a season, you know, what Dr. King calls the winter of despair. That is what we're going through. But to you, Ambassador, you've been there, you've been doing this work for a very long time. Think of all the little successes you've been able to achieve. Go back to why they were possible and tell yourself, I want to replicate those successes. And we need to provide more opportunity to bring in civil society leaders to talk to ourselves. We need a joint therapy session to tell ourselves, I know what you're going through, keep going. And the final thing was that after the SARS protest, we convened a discrete event somewhere in Lagos, outskirts of Lagos, bringing in some of the celebrities, civil society activists, and a few other people just to talk to each other about what has happened. And the first day of the event was in the evening. And that evening, we said to ourselves, we're not going to talk policy. We're going to open up the room and ask people to just talk about how they feel, where they are at this moment, and what is that thing, you know, burdening their spirit. Let me tell you, Patrick, in this room, there were older people, there were young people, there were not so old people. We shared tears. I'm not saying sharing. We shared tears. I'm serious. People just opened up about the vulnerabilities they've been dealing with, because people like Ambassador Noja, they do this job day in, day out. Do they ever have a space where they can just be human and break down and talk about their own pain? We need to do a lot of that with our change makers. Perhaps they will find the zeal to start up again.
Jude, my Q&A tab is blowing up with questions, and we have 10 minutes to go. So let me try and get many of them in. I have one from Abbas Udoaka. Brilliant session. Fukuyama also talked about social cohesion. When the conversation about change is brought up within the Nigeria space, it always appears that we neglect the issue of morality. What are your thoughts on this?
So
1 minute.
I try to stay away from this morality question, because it means it could be very divisive, because our moral compasses are different. But I do then think that we need to agree on some common values and some common principles, and agree on them and publicize them. We've talked about, about a couple of them in this conversation, but we need to be a bit more deliberate in selling those values: empathy, hard work, truthfulness, watching out for each other. I think we need to project those values a bit more. Let us focus on the values we share, and not the ones that we disagree with.
There's a question from Raphael Davis. To what extent is the National Youth Service Corps an effort to move beyond the ethnic boundaries that exist in Nigeria? And to what extent would a national understanding of oneself as Nigerian erode an understanding of a person's ethnic roots? It seems there is some fear of forgetting one's ethnic roots embedded in a resistance to seeing one Nigerian.
Wow, that's profound. So two things I will say. I think the concept of National Youth Service is good. The implementation has been horrific and horrible. If we have to...
Of late, it used to be good before. Yeah.
Of late, yes. So let us go and find out where the rain started beating us on that one and fix it. Because I think a lot of people have forged important relationships, important understanding of the country. It was meant to be a harmonization and unity building initiative. So let's go back to those values of it. I think is useful. To your point about being Nigerian, reducing my being Igbo, I don't think so. I can be both African.
The question is it the fear of becoming an Igbo that has stopped us from trying to become Nigerian?
Yes, I get that. What I'm saying is that I don't think we should worry about that. And we need to help people understand that you can be both Igbo, Nigeria, Africa, Muslim, Arsenal fan at the same time.
Food lover.
At the same time. Yes, at the same time. They are not mutually exclusive. And I also think there's also a beauty in being Nigerian and being Igbo. Because I bring in the can-do spirit of my ancestors to the Nigeria conversation. You bring in the qualities of your own ancestors to the Nigeria conversation. We have beautiful traditions. I say to anybody who cares to listen, there is no homeless person in my town. Not one person. If we take that kind of tradition and bring it into the Nigeria conversation, it is a boost for our country. And there are other traditional practices elsewhere that bring the same level of quality and respect and dignity for life that we can bring into the conversation. So I agree with you that people might think about that because, of course, in the pre-colonial conversation, it was a problem. It was a fear. But life has shown us that it shouldn't be. And perhaps this forum should be part of those conversations about being Hausa is not antithetical to being Nigerian.
Exactly. There's a question from Chukwuebuka Obigwe. How do we raise more Nigerians who can first lead themselves, before we expect them to lead change in society? So how do you develop the human capital of the Nigerian to, have that agency of leading self and then bring that to the broader societal level conversations?
I mean, we talked a bit about it at the beginning, using the investment in human resources and human capital by Singapore. But I think it is really, really important, this whole thing about building individuals, molding people when they're young, to bring some certain values and predispositions to the table as young people, and then grow up with it. We don't value people in the country, sadly. This is a country that doesn't value life. This is a country that doesn't value skills. How will that change? I don't know. But again, let us start in our own little communities to start paying attention to these qualities and to this need amongst those whose life we can actually influence at that point.
There's a question from Hadiza, if I can get to it. How can policy programs, panels, and committee reports be institutionalized to ensure implementation and continuity? You spoke about the Ronsaye report and the life it's traveled in the last, I guess, 10, 12 years now. Is there anything that civil society can do to ensure that when government sets up these committees and so on, and they come up with reports, that they're honor-bound or duty-bound to ensure that they're implemented, institutionalized in one way or the other?
I think it's demand. It's public demand. Civil society can engineer public demand, media, young people, everybody. But it still comes down to what we said before, leadership. Why would I spend millions to get a report that I don't want to use? What's the point? People are looking for solutions. People are looking for blueprints for what they need to do for their country. Here, we have these blueprints all over the place, and people are not using it. You know, I'm told of a particular leader who came into government. Before he came in, he commissioned this huge 360 review of government policies and everything. And there were volumes of reports. And then there was the executive summary, which is a very small booklet. I'm told in 8 years, he never read that book. In 8 years. So that answers your question. So I think leadership, leadership, leadership.
Let's think about that a little bit. So something must have forced him or compelled him to ask for that review, right? You know, maybe it's because people in society, civil society, the rest of us have been talking about, oh, there's no continuity, blah, blah, blah. So he commissions it. Now he's got the document to show, oh, okay, I'm thinking about it. But maybe it's because there hasn't been as much advocacy on ensuring that he reads the report and implements what's in it. You know, that what's in the report is made obvious to the people, and that somebody is tracking to see what government said it will do in the report that it has not done. And maybe that would then force this person in question or their class to spend more time reading those reports and implementing. So again, isn't this a failure of civil society? Going back to that civil society's sleeping moment.
So in this instance, I would say that I was demand. And I would also say that we pioneered something which is called the pressimeter. So I wouldn't call it the other name because it would then say who I'm talking about.
Yes.
We commissioned something called the pressimeter. And I remember it was...
Although anybody who's followed Nigeria knows who you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
it always meant that every quarter there's a town hall where the implementing organization publishes report on the performance of key sectors of government and invite the ministers to say, this was what you promised. This was what your government promised. This is what you've been able to do. This is the gap. What is your explanation?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after they came for the first and second one, they never showed up again. You know, and in one instance, they said, what do you want us to come and say? So my point is, I also think, Patrick, the lack of shame. I don't know how we've gotten to a situation of shamelessness, where as a human being, not now as a leader, I commit myself to something. I don't do it, and I don't feel any shame when I'm called out on it. Rather, I will say, the person before me did not do it, and the person coming after me may not do it. So this absence of shame. So the whole idea of shaming public officers to do the right thing, I think we've also lost that in Nigeria, because we are now operating on a level of shamelessness. That can only explain what budget found out in their reports on the budget, for instance, because they knew it was going to go public. They knew we will know about it, but they don't care about what we say. So I don't know, maybe that's another conversation, the era of shamelessness. Maybe you can explore that in the next conversation.
Maybe my last question is on, you know, you referenced John Lewis in the book, you know, making good trouble.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've reflected on how a nation can create a sizable part of its population as people who just make good trouble. How do you get to a point? What are the steps to forming this nation where a larger number of people in the country feel that they are honor bound to make good trouble? And because I think that's how you put the feet of the leaders to the fire, you force for certain things to happen. Can we create a nation of people who make good trouble?
I think we can. I think we need family at the family level, the things we teach our kids, the values we teach them, the fierce sense of justice we imbibe in them, education. I think we should take our curriculum in our primary, secondary, and university education in Nigeria, burn them, and design something else that is fit for the time. I think we really need to start thinking about values as a key component of the education we teach, the things we teach our kids. And this whole sense of community and building up as an integral DNA in the system of our kids and ourselves. So I think education is important. I think also society, the things we glorify and the things we condemn, I find them really embarrassing. We are so given now to vainglory, the way we prize wealth without hard work, the way we celebrate deviant behavior, the way we celebrate arrogance and people being mean. Oh, if you talk to this person on social media, his response is fire. And we need to rethink all of these things. If we do that, frankly, we will have these people that make good trouble. Young people who will tell you to your face, this is wrong, and we will not support you. And then we need to reward good behavior. Outside of punishing bad behavior, we need to reward good behavior. That is why I dedicated some chapters on this book talking about individuals. Innocent Chukwuma, Sam Mbakwe, Gani Fawemi, Nigerians who did things differently. And who I think should be studied in our universities, in our secondary school, about the lives they lived and showing them up as models for the kids to follow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. My final question. You're at the Hilton, you're in the elevator with President Tinubu, heading up to the 10th floor. What are the 3 things you tell him that he should be doing now to win back the streets and use that buy-in to drive the transformation he seeks for Nigeria?
So I struggle to think he wants to transform Nigeria. That's my opinion. I hope I'm wrong. I think that the fundamental problem is the starting point of his administration is a bit of an extractive relationship with Nigeria. But that is a conversation for another day. 3 things. 1, stop the profligacy. The absurd spending and misplaced priorities has to stop. Because if you plug the hole, it's very simple. If you keep in what you have and plug the leakage of what is going out, you're able to find a bit of a balance to start rebuilding the country. So I think as a starting point, this obscene and useless spending needs to stop. The second thing, he needs to run a clean government. This has become one of the most extractive government that I have seen, just going by the reports we read. I mean, maybe they're exaggerated, but what we read suggests that this is a very bit of an extractive government. The third one, heal the nation. Be a president of Nigeria. Let the woman and the fatheress of the North, the man in the East, the man in the middle belt, see you as their leader and not somebody from another side. And you have to model that in your appointments, in your decisions, and the way you're talking to Nigerians. No Nigerian president has spent time in recent times to model a behavior that says we are one nation. We heard Buhari talk about, I am for everybody, I'm for nobody. But his behavior was a total opposite of that very profound statement. We need to see people who are leading Nigeria, not people who come across as driving an agenda of which Nigeria comes second.
Jude, thank you so much for joining this conversation. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
And for our participants, please join us again in 2 weeks' time, Wednesday, October 2nd, same time. And my guest will be Yemi Adameloku of Enough is Enough. And we will continue this conversation in our series on civil society and their role in national development. And so to everyone, thank you for joining, and see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank
Jude,
you.
thanks a lot.
Thank you.